Submitted for your approval. The case of one Miss Agnes Grepp, put on Earth with 2 left feet, an overabundance of thumbs, and a propensity for falling down manholes. In a moment, she will be up to her jaw in miracles, wrought by apprentice angel Harmon Cavender, intent on winning his wings. And though it's a fact that both of them should have stood in bed, they will tempt all the fates by moving into the cold, gray dawn of the Twilight Zone.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedman.
And I'm Chili Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomrin is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. Did you know that Rod Serling only said the catchphrase "submitted for your approval" 3 times during the 5 seasons of The Twilight Zone? This fact alone demonstrates just how memorable pretty much everything about that show is. And if there's anything as iconic as The Twilight Zone, it's the show's creator and chief writer, Rod Serling, the subject of a terrific graphic biography by today's guest.
We're delighted to talk with Koren Shadmi, a cartoonist, illustrator, and author of The Twilight Man, Rod Serling, and the Birth of Television. Among his other books are Lugosi, The Rise and Fall of Hollywood's Dracula, and A for Anonymous, How a Mysterious Hacker Collective Transformed the World. Koren, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You didn't grow up with The Twilight Zone. How did you discover the show?
Yeah, I grew up in Israel, and we didn't have it on syndication or at all, basically. It was never on TV. The only thing I saw was the 90s reboot. So that was my first introduction to a version of The Twilight Zone. But in, about like 2009 or 10, it all became available, I believe, on Netflix. And I started watching it. I was like, well, it's time I catch up to this. All I knew about it was through other pop culture references like The Simpsons and all these other places. And so I started watching, and I was hooked, and I was just so impressed by the show, and just also shocked that it was that old, and still that a lot of the episodes are still really hold up really, really well, and are just really kind of hit a nerve with me. And so I was just really impressed by it and kept thinking about it. And, there's some friends that I would be like, you got to watch this episode. And I became kind of like a convert.
Did you start with the first episode?
I don't remember. I think maybe I did it by order. And for some reason, one of the seasons was missing from Netflix. And then later I was like, oh my God, there's a whole season. I feel like, the quality varies like a lot. And some of them are just unbelievably incredible. And some of them are just goofy. Some of them are funny, yeah, I mean, some of my favorite episode, which I think a lot of people's favorite, is Eye of the Beholder. I think it's as good as any Ingmar Bergman movie. It's just so, so good. And then there you have another episode that it's just I watched with my son recently, where these 2 astronauts show up at a planet and they realize there's a colony of tiny people. And it's a great idea, but the rocket looks like it's made out of styrofoam, and everything is just so cheap, and so I'm just like, oh, so they really vary, but they're still fun. Even the ones that are kind of kooky and cheap are still really enjoyable.
I feel with Eye of the Beholder in particular, that one is so ubiquitous in American popular culture that even if you haven't seen the show, you'd probably know what the punchline is of that particular episode, which takes kind of the surprise out of it. It's kind of like Soylent Green with Charlton Heston, which is an interesting premise, but if you already know the premise going into that movie, it's a crappy movie. But I think from your perspective, coming to it very green and new and fresh, you kind of got to see it in a way that was similar to the original audience.
Yeah, I didn't know. I mean, I knew some references, but I didn't know a lot of it. And I was watching it for the first time and feeling like there's a lot of the themes that it deals with are still prevalent. It's more than the sum of its parts. Like again, Serling comes from a background of writing these very distinguished, very complicated TV plays. When TV started, they didn't really know what to do with the medium yet, so they would basically do the equivalent of theater on TV, and that's what he was aiming for. He kind of wanted to be like a theater writer, and so, with the Twilight Zone, he was trying to kind of deliver messages that were really tricky to deliver at the time in popular, in on television, on like such a big medium that was like very heavily censored. So he kind of snuck in all these ideas under the guise of like a sci-fi fantasy show.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
Your choice to illustrate the Twilight Man in glorious black and white was perfect. How did you go about capturing the early days of television in your drawings?
Well, luckily, there's a lot of reference out there. There's a lot of pictures from productions and stuff that gives you an idea of how um, it looked like. It was bigger. Like the cameras were enormous. And the quality wasn't very good of the um the quality where you got it on your TV. Luckily, the Twilight Zone was recorded on film and preserved, so now we get it at like very high level quality. But it was like the early stages. It was just kind of like a medium in its infancy. And through working on the project, I found out more about its history, which is really interesting, really fascinating. And it was really considered like kind of a lower version of much lower to film. Film was, regarded, and for many years after, it was still considered. It's only in recent years that TV and film are kind of being kind of reach almost the same level with certain productions. But um, so it was really interesting, fascinating to find things out. For instance, I remember reading about, things were broadcast live. So a lot of shows were broadcast live early on, before the Twilight Zone. So Playhouse 90 was broadcast not live. And if there was an accident or someone, misread their lines, the whole nation would see it. That's just how it was. I remember reading about a production where one of the actors cut their leg on one of the, like metal in on set while they were shooting, and they just had to keep going. There was a guy on the ground behind him, like blotting out the blood with a towel until the production was over because you just couldn't stop. Like you had to keep going. So it was a interesting kind of very similar to actual plays where there's really no, there's no second takes, and if something happens, something happens, and so it gives it like this kind of lively um feeling. But by the time the Twilight Zone came, it was all recorded already. So
When Serling enlisted in the army during World War II, he wanted to fight the Nazis, but was sent to the Pacific Theater instead. How were his life and art shaped by his military service?
these men were shipped out to the war and came back very, very traumatized, because what they saw, what they experienced back then, there was no way of really dealing with it back then properly. They would just tell them you're shell shocked. There wasn't even the word trauma yet. And you were just told to like kind of man it up and take a, take some whiskey and just, you know, bear it and deal with it. And with a lot of these people, like all their trauma ends up being reflected through their art, or just like coming out in these really strange visuals or ideas or artwork. So even someone like Jack Kirby, who also was served in World War II, um, came back also traumatized, and all this crazy stuff comes out on the page where you're like, how is he even coming up with that? Well, it's your brain still years later processing this trauma. And with Serling, it was the same thing. He experienced some harrowing things. He saw his friends die in front of his eyes. He almost died a few times. And there's something kind of surreal about it, and his view of the world was forever changed, and we kind of see this kind of the Twilight Zone is a reflection of the way he sees the world.
I think it comes out even more so what you're saying in The Loner, his rather unsuccessful but very interesting Western that he did a few years after The Twilight Zone, where an ex-Union soldier played by Lloyd Bridges is trying to piece together his life again after the very traumatic Civil War. And you can absolutely see that that was a stand-in for Rod Serling himself.
Yeah, I watched there was an event called Serling Fest, and I went and watched finally 2 episodes of The Loner, and I can see why it probably didn't succeed. And I think it's very philosophical. There's like a lot of talking and maybe not enough action for the viewers. Um, but yes, there's that sense of kind of like someone who's kind of drifting around and trying to make sense of his own life after experiencing this very intense war, these war events. And I think in Serling too, he was just probably felt very very lonely in a sense, because he was once you go through that, you don't see the world the same way that people that didn't serve in the war do. So there's that camaraderie, and so that's very important.
As you were mentioning before, Rod Serling wrote for other anthology programs like the Kraft Television Theater and Playhouse 90 before getting fed up with the network censors and setting out on his own. How did Serling come up with the idea for a socially conscious sci-fi series?
Like you see in the book, kind of that he really went through these struggles, and again and again would try to get these ideas through. Like he wanted to do um an episode of Playhouse 90 about lynching. He wanted to do things about what was going on in the South, racism. And each time, again and again, the censors would kind of like erode his idea into something that almost doesn't mean anything. And then he has this kind of eureka moment where he thinks, well, what if I just do a show about robots and space aliens, and that show is secretly about all the issues we deal with. And I'm kind of like gonna deliver, like kind of like a contraband, deliver my message in a very like poppy or like deceiving almost manner. And that's exactly what he did. So you have episodes that just flew by the censors, that are, they think, oh, it's about aliens, or oh, it's about, I don't know, like a little kid that like sends everybody to the cornfield, but really it's about, McCarthyism. It's about like fascism. It's dealing with all these things that he used the medium to sneak it through. And I don't think he was like, I think people did that often in science fiction at the time, and it wasn't definitely the first time that was done as an idea, but it was the first time that it was done on TV, I feel like, and in that level of sophistication. And what he managed to do was deliver the ideas, but also make the episodes really fun and exciting, and well made. And so that's why I think the show succeeded, because they are, yeah, sure, the ideas are there, but you have these crazy visuals, crazy concepts, good stories, and it all works together.
Yeah, terrific actors too. And I think really the secret sauce of the Twilight Zone, as I'm thinking about it, is that it was only a half an hour, the episodes. Because, I recently watched Patterns, which was one of his breakthrough plays on TV and that sort of thing. But it kind of drags because it's too long. And I think even Night Gallery was too long. The thing with the half an hour restriction, I think everything that you're saying about it being exciting, and there's not a lot of downtime in these episodes, are clean and very straightforward in their own way. I think it was really the format that helped him excel in the way that he did with The Twilight Zone.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's that one season that all of a sudden they turn it into an hour, and there's no classic episodes in that season. Or there might be one, I don't know, but not that I can remember. And so yeah, it's just really uh condensed, cut to, perfection, and yes, like like a template for um yeah, very, very, very rapid, quick television. That's why it still works today, I feel like. Even people, my son, that, he has the attention span of a 2025 kid. He can sit down and watch a Twilight Zone episode, because yeah, there's no like long, it just keeps on going, and keeps you interested mostly.
Yeah, my kids are into it too. And I got into it when I was, in middle school also. So it does work. And I think the other thing that really works about it is the black and white, which again you captured so well in the book. It gives it a timeless, almost ethereal quality if you're watching it in the context of everything else being so, overproduced in the color and everything else. It actually stands out because of just the fact that it looks different with all the shadows and all the grays and everything else. It's beautiful in that way.
Yeah, it's shot beautifully. The film really gives it this like arty quality, and that's where it's kind of plays really well between this kind of pop, almost like B movie concepts, and like really high production quality, and like very beautiful cinematography. So, and again, yeah, like you're saying, he had really good actors, he had really good writers. He had like Richard Matheson and um Clayton. Like, he had all these like really great writers. He had great directors. Richard Donner is one of the directors, another good Jew. And then so there's many talented people that worked on this, and it's because Serling had the track record. He knew all the people. The show had cachet. It was able to attract like really good actors and really good talent, and that was his idea too. That's how he sold it.
Serling converted to Unitarianism, in part to appease his wife's father, and he was active in the Unitarian Community Church of Santa Monica. You write that Serling may have converted to Unitarianism, but his creations felt Jewish in nature. Could you explain?
Yeah, I think you can take the Judaism out of the Jew, but you can't take the Jew out of the Jew? I don't know how to say that. But basically you stay Jewish, no matter what happens. And I think that, there's this sense of dread that I think is part of the Jewish way of seeing the world, unfortunately, after all these pogroms and like living in Europe and being always like hounded. Then you're just like, the sky's gonna fall, any day. It's all gonna be over. This kind of anxiety, this they're out to get you kind of feeling. feeling of dread, and that it shows in the Twilight Zone. Um, and there's also, these are kind of tales of morality, which is just also, it's also a tradition in Judaism where it's like these tales of morality, Haggadot, and Mishalim, which is, these like old time me tales, and you would always have kind of a message in the end. And it's the same with the Twilight Zone. Serling is a master storyteller, and there's like a grain of take it with you home and learn from it. And it's almost like he is kind of like a television rabbi, in disguise.
He has a reputation also for being kind of a gloomy guy when it comes to his worldview. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, he definitely was. And you can see it in the show, and you can hear it the way he talks. Later in his life, he gave a lot of speeches in universities, and he's a little bit of a doom prophet, and you hear it in his speaking, and sometimes it sounds like he's speaking about our day and age. So he definitely was a humanist. He was a liberal guy, and he was bothered by a lot of the things that were happening at the time. And and uh and I think it shows in his creation, it shows in his writing, and his choice of subject matter.
Speaking of his sort of famous gloominess, I think you can see the way that that took its toll over the years, and you captured it really beautifully in your illustrations of him in the book. You can see the aging process and the way that he gets beat down by life.
Yeah, he aged a lot. He was really into tanning, and also smoking, like smoked a lot, tanned a lot, and by the time he was in his late 40s, he looked beyond his years, because he didn't live like a very healthy lifestyle.
Rod Serling died when he was just 50. He was, of course, a heavy smoker and a workaholic. Do you think he worked himself to death?
Possibly, I think it mostly was the smoking, because he died from a heart attack. And in his later years, he wasn't working as much. In fact, one of the tragedies is that he was kind of, he was the it boy for a while, and then he was completely ejected, and would do commercials. Like if you Google it, you can still see like all these commercials that he did in the early 70s.
65 electronic projects brought to reality with his science fair kit. Astonishing? Perhaps. But you can find it for Christmas for $17.95 in a place that's known as Radio Shack.
He definitely worked too hard. He worked 7 days a week. He wrote like 90 of the episodes of the Twilight Zone. He One of my favorite episodes is Last Stop at Willoughby, where the man basically is like on a train, and he goes to work. He's like an ad exec on Madison Avenue, and he's under an incredible amount of stress, and he is basically fantasizing about his death the whole time. He gets to this beautiful place called Willoughby, and he keeps getting there and waking up, and he's not there. And then finally, like, you see him on the tracks, and they're like, "Oh no, like another guy, jumped off the train or whatever." And I think that Serling worked so hard that that was him. Like, that was someone who's just doesn't know when to stop, is doing work to escape reality, to escape certain things, escape like his own traumas, his own demons, and and hurting himself in the process. So yeah, it definitely was. And he knew he knew at the time that smoking wasn't good for him. It wasn't, people already knew then. And so there's an element of like kind of self-punishment, and, you know, unfortunately, it is what it is.
Your book is a wonderful introduction to Serling's life and career, and we highly recommend it. For those in our audience who are perhaps new to the Twilight Zone, which episode would you recommend as a starting point?
Yeah, so like I said, my all-time favorite is Eye of the Beholder. But I also Really, really love Time Enough and at Last.
There's time enough at last.
Which is also classic. I kind of like all the classic ones that I think most people like. To Serve Mankind is amazing. So those are three of the episodes. There's also one that I think is called The Hitchhiker. And that one is also a favorite. That's maybe less of the top popular ones, but I love that one too, where a woman is basically like there's this hitchhiker keep haunting her, and it turns out you'll see in the episode what it turns out to be. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Koren, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.